The gravel crunched under my tires, a sound that usually grated on me, but today it was a small comfort, a familiar friction against the vast, unsettling silence of the estate. For years, my life had been a symphony of controlled movements, the whisper of a badger hairbrush against aged varnish, the soft click of a tiny brass latch, the gentle thump of a restored tome closing. Precision was my craft, my religion. Every gouge, every stain, every faded line on an antique held a story I meticulously uncovered, then carefully preserved. I didn't just mend things, I resurrected their dignity. But this place. This was something else entirely. The solicitor's voice, thin and reedy over the phone, had only hinted at the scale of my inheritance. A manor, Reid. Isolated. Decaying, I'm afraid. And rather old. Understatement, I now realized, was a language he spoke fluently. And there it was. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the walls, its tendrils prying apart the very fabric of the structure. Windows, countless and vacant, stared out like unseeing eyes, some shattered, others opaque with centuries of grime. The air, even from the car, carried a heavy, vegetal scent of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else. A dry, papery smell of extreme age. I cut the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute, pressing in on me, making my ears ache. No birdsong, no distant hum of traffic, just the faint, rhythmic drip 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 from a broken gutter somewhere high above. I sat there for a long moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, taking it all in. This wasn't a restoration project, it was an archaeological dig. And something about its sheer, overwhelming presence, its profound stillness, made the hairs prickle on my arms. Stepping out, the gravel fell loose beneath my sensible work boots. The scale of the place swallowed me whole. The front door, a massive slab of oak studded with iron, seemed to sag under its own weight. Its once grand paint peeled like sunburnt skin. It turned with a reluctant groan, a sound that echoed not just through the door, but seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. I pushed the door inward, and it swung open with another protracted shriek, revealing a cavernous entry hall. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't merely neglected, it was entombed. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy fanlight above the door. A grand staircase, its banister carved with intricate, swirling patterns, swept upwards into gloom. Velvet drapes, heavy and faded, hung in tatters from tall windows, blocking out most of the afternoon sun. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of decay and something else I couldn't quite place, a faint, almost sweet aroma, like old potpourri gone bad. Every step I took on the flagstone floor sent small clouds of dust puffing into the air. This was a lifetime of work, maybe two. The sheer scope of it should have daunted me, but instead, a strange, almost obsessive determination began to stir. This was the ultimate puzzle, the grandest challenge. I moved deeper, my footsteps the only sound, echoing unervingly in the vast space. I passed through what must have been a formal dining room, the enormous table still laden with dust-shrouded chairs, looking like specters at a banquet. Further on, I discovered a smaller chamber off what I presumed was a library, judging by the skeletal remains of shelves lining the walls. This room was peculiar. It was separated from the main library by an internal wall, and access was through a narrow, heavy door. Inside, it was cramped, almost claustrophobic, with a single, unusually thick window looking back into the library. The glass was so dense, so layered with grime and perhaps some internal discoloration, that it distorted the already dim light, making the adjoining room appear even more indistinct, like a memory scene through thick water. It struck me as odd, this isolated cubbyhole, almost like a private observation post. I found myself thinking of the only other time I'd encountered glass quite so robust, so deliberately opaque, a muted, sepulchral space, almost a visiting room with reinforced glass from a distant, unpleasant memory of a relative I'd barely known. The thought was jarring, out of place in this old manor, yet it lingered. My gaze drifted from the odd window to a section of the wall beside it. Unlike the general decay, this area seemed to have been deliberately covered. A large, ornate tapestry, its colors long since bleached into shades of indeterminate gray, hung crookedly, obscuring a portion of the plaster. It was heavier than it looked, its weight pulling down on the fragile rod from which it hung. My fingers, accustomed to discerning the smallest imperfections, traced the stiff, matted fabric. Beneath it, I felt a distinct difference in the wall's texture. Not plaster, but something solid, unyielding. Curiosity, that familiar, dangerous spark, flared. I gently tugged at the bottom corner of the tapestry. It resisted, but then, with a soft tear of ancient threads, it pulled away slightly. It wasn't a door, nor a window. It was a panel, perfectly flush with the wall, it seems almost invisible. My fingers explored its surface, searching for a catch, a hinge, anything. There was nothing. It wasn't a family crest or a decorative flourish. It was a series of interlocking, irregular lines, sharp angles meeting curved forms, looking less like a symbol and more like a knot of tangled nerves. This wasn't just old, it felt deliberate. Hidden. I pushed the tapestry back into place, the odd symbol once again concealed. My mind, usually so clear and focused, felt a subtle tremor. The determined restorer was still there, but now, a flicker of unease danced at the edges of my resolve. This house had secrets, I realized, that went far beyond architectural decay. I'd spent the morning unloading my meticulous array of tools from the truck, each case placed with surgical precision in the cavernous, dusty entrance hall. The light filtering through the grime-streaked windows was thin, turning the motes dancing in the air into slow-motion ghosts. This wasn't just a new project, it was an inheritance, a legacy of decay I was determined to reverse. My first task, I decided, would be a room on the ground floor, tucked away from the main drawing rooms. It wasn't mentioned in the estate agent's brief notes, nor did it appear on any of the faded blueprints I'd found crumpled in a drawer. I'd stumbled upon it during my initial walkthrough, a door almost entirely obscured by a collapsed tapestry. When I finally forced it open, what I found inside was bewildering. A visiting room with reinforced glass. It was a stark, almost brutalist anomaly within the manor's otherwise ornate, if decaying, grandeur. One entire wall was dominated by a colossal pane of glass, thick and cloudy with age, set into a frame of heavy, tarnished steel. On my side, a narrow, worn wooden bench ran the length of the wall. On the other side of the glass, a single, high-backed chair sat facing it, shrouded in a thin film of dust. The room was devoid of any other furniture, its walls bare, the floorboards dark and splintered. This room, with its unsettling strangeness, presented an immediate challenge. A perfect starting point. I set up my folding workbench, spreading out my brushes, solvents, and various abrasives. My brass-handled scraper, a favorite for removing stubborn grime, went to its usual spot on the right. I donned my thick canvas apron, the familiar way to comfort. I began with the wooden bench, scraping away layers of dried varnish and what looked like ancient mildew. The work was slow, painstaking, each stroke revealing the pale, unsuspecting grain beneath. The only sounds were the soft rasp of my scraper and the occasional creak of the old house settling around me. Hours passed in this quiet, focused rhythm. When I paused for a moment, stretching my shoulders, I reached for my brass-handled scraper. It wasn't there. My eyes scanned the workbench, then the floor around my feet. Nothing. I frowned. I always put it in the same place. Must have knocked it off, I thought, bending to check under the bench. Still nothing. My mind was probably still adjusting to the quiet, the isolation. I grabbed a different scraper, a smaller, less comfortable one, and resumed my work. Minutes later, a faint tap-tap echoed from somewhere behind the reinforced glass. I stopped, listening. I stared at the reinforced glass, its surface reflecting my own dust-smeared face like a distorted mirror. Nothing moved on the other side, just the dusty, high-backed chair. Old pipes, I reasoned, picking up my work again. Or maybe a branch scraping the roof. But the sound had come from inside, from the other side of that unsettling pane. A high-backed chair on the other side of the glass. I could have sworn it was facing directly towards the glass when I started. Now, it seemed subtly angled, as if it had been shifted slightly to the left, towards the corner of the small, dusty space beyond. It was a minor adjustment, barely perceptible, but it caught my eye. I stopped scraping, the tool suspended in midair. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary gasp. My mind immediately replayed my initial observations, the chair perfectly centered, facing the reinforced glass. Now, it wasn't. My internal monologue, usually so rational and precise, stuttered. The house settling. The floorboards shifting. An illusion of perspective. But the shift felt too deliberate. My heart gave a sudden, hard thump against my ribs, a dull percussion against the suffocating quiet. I turned slowly, my eyes sweeping the empty room, but there was nothing. I was alone. Or so I told myself. But the feeling of being observed, sharp and undeniable, had taken root. The light filtered weakly through the grimy panes of the grand bay window, illuminating dancing motes of dust that seemed to possess a life of their own. My first target, the massive oak paneling that lined the main stairwell, a warped and grumbling testament to decades of neglect. I ran a gloved hand over the dark, pitted wood, feeling for loose sections, for the subtle give of rot beneath the varnish. The work was familiar, comforting in its precision, a methodical dance of observation and intervention. My fingers traced the intricate carvings, the faded heraldry of a family long gone. The wood groaned softly under my touch, a low, resonant sigh that vibrated through my fingertips. It was then I noticed it, not a crack, not a warp, but an almost imperceptible seam, a hairline fracture in the grain that didn't align with the natural flow of the timber. It ran vertically, from floor to ceiling, hidden expertly beneath layers of grime and old wax. A prickle of curiosity, sharper than the usual professional interest, urged me on. I retrieved a thin, flexible probe from my kit, a delicate instrument designed to investigate without causing damage. There was resistance, then a faint click. A small section of the paneling, perhaps 3 feet wide, shifted inward with a soft, grinding protest. A wave of stagnant, cold air, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something like dried iron, pushed out, raising gooseflesh on my arms. I grabbed my high-lumen tactical flashlight, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. It was a passage, short and rough-hewn, leading to a heavy, unadorned wooden door, unlike anything else in the Manor's ornate design. This door was thick, reinforced with crude iron bands, and utterly devoid of a handle or visible latch. It looked like it had been sealed from the outside, then plastered over. My heart hammered a slow, insistent rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't just a hidden compartment for valuables, this felt different, deliberate, almost punitive. Near the bottom, where the wood met the floor, I found a small, almost flush iron plate. A quick twist with a flathead screwdriver, and it sprang open, revealing a rusted keyhole. I had no key, of course, but the mechanism was simple. The door swung inward with a drawn-out shriek of rusty hinges, revealing a small, stark room. But what seized my attention, dominating the far wall, was a massive sheet of glass. Why would a grand manor house have such a thing? The implications were immediate and deeply unsettling. On a low, stone shelf built into the wall opposite the reinforced glass, sat a single, small, leather-bound ledger. Its cover was cracked and dry, the pages within brittle and yellowed. I picked it up, the leather cool and smooth beneath my gloved fingers. The entries were handwritten in a spidery, looping script, dated sporadically across several decades in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It listens. It waits. Another gone. Not fled. Simply absent. Small things. Names. Dates. The purpose of my own hand. The glass holds, for now. But what happens when the hunger turns inward? I closed the ledger, the sound of the leather cover snapping shut echoing in the small room. I stood there, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand, the words from the ledger replaying in my mind. I find myself forgetting. Small things. Suddenly, a peculiar blankness descended. I tried to recall the specific details of the last conversation I'd had with the estate agent, the one who'd convinced me this manor was a worthwhile project. Her name, her face, the exact phrasing of her reassurances, it was all there, just beyond reach, like trying to grasp smoke. A smooth, featureless wall had risen where those memories should have been. It was just stress, I told myself, the isolation, the unexpected discovery. My mind was playing tricks. I'd been so focused, so deep in the past of this house, that my own present was blurring. I attributed it to the sheer strangeness of finding a hidden visiting room with reinforced glass, and a journal hinting at such disturbing local history. Still, the feeling persisted, a subtle, unnerving erosion. A fleeting sense of not quite being myself settled over me, like an ill-fitting coat. I carefully placed the ledger back on the shelf, then closed and relocked the reinforced door. I would deal with that tomorrow. I closed the ledger, the sound of the leather cover meeting the aged pages a dull thud in the suffocating quiet. The cold dread in my gut wasn't just the Manor's chill, it was something deeper, a creeping suspicion that the house wasn't merely old, but actively malevolent. The previous owner's fragmented notes hinted at an insidious presence, a consumption far beyond the physical decay I was so accustomed to restoring. I needed more than hints. I needed facts, or at least, the closest thing to them I could find. The next morning, after a restless night filled with the kind of formless anxiety that clings to the edges of sleep, I drove into the nearest town. The local historical society was housed in a cramped, dusty building, smelling of old paper and forgotten lives. A stout, bespectacled archivist, whose name I immediately forgot, directed me to a shelf overflowing with local histories and faded newspaper archives. Hours bled into one another. My fingers grew grimy with dust as I sifted through brittle pages, searching for any mention of the manor, or the family who had owned it for generations. The early records were sparse, property transfers and tax assessments. Then, I started finding them, the whispers. The first was a brief mention in an 1887 Society column, noting the unfortunate decline of a previous owner, a gentleman known for his sharp wit, who had become withdrawn and prone to melancholia, eventually vanishing from public life entirely. No death certificate, no record of relocation. Just a blank space where a life used to be. Another clipping from 1923 detailed the peculiar disappearance of a young woman, a governess at the manor, whose belongings were found undisturbed, but the woman herself simply ceased to exist. The police investigation yielded nothing. A later article, from the 1950s, spoke of the manor's then owner, a respected local magistrate, who was found wandering the nearby woods, disoriented and muttering about stolen thoughts and empty spaces. He was eventually placed in a facility, though the specifics were vague, and he never recovered his faculties. Each account was a loose thread, a fragmented piece of a tapestry depicting loss and unraveling minds. No explicit connections were drawn between the incidents, but the sheer repetition, always tied to my manor, sent a shiver down my spine. I returned to the manor under a bruised twilight sky, the information I'd gathered weighing on me like stones. The house seemed to watch me, its empty windows like vacant eyes. That night, the dreams came with a vengeance. I woke with a gasp, sweat plastering my hair to my temples, the metallic tang of the dream lingering on my tongue. The next day, the unease sharpened into something more insidious. I was polishing a mahogany desk, the rhythmic motion usually a comfort, when I paused, unsure if I had already polished that particular section. A moment later, I found myself staring at a half-finished cup of tea on the workbench, utterly perplexed as to when I had made it. I didn't remember pouring the water, or steeping the leaves. Just the cup, steaming gently. Perhaps I was just tired. But the incidents grew. I'd walk into a room, intent on a task, only to stand there, mind blank, the purpose of my journey evaporated. I'd find tools laid out in configurations I couldn't recall arranging, or a window I swore I had closed, now standing ajar. My meticulous routines, the bedrock of my craft and my sanity, began to fray at the edges. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The patterns on the tapestry seemed to shift, the stylized figures twisting into grotesque, leering faces that weren't there a moment before. My breath hitched. I blinked, hard, rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, the tapestry was just a tapestry, its thread still and faded. My heart hammered against my ribs. Later, I was in the library, poring over more of the manor's scattered documents, when a sudden, jarring image slammed into my mind. It wasn't a memory, not exactly, but a vivid, terrifying vision. Before me, a thick, reinforced glass panel separated me from an empty corridor. I was trapped, utterly alone, and utterly exposed. This wasn't the manor. It was somewhere else, somewhere profoundly isolating. The image held me captive for a long, agonizing moment, then dissolved, leaving me gasping, my hands trembling so violently I dropped the brittle page I was holding. My mind, my sanctuary, felt compromised. I was Reid, the meticulous restorer, a man of order and precision. But the lines were blurring, the edges of my identity softening, dissolving. The fragmented accounts I'd found weren't just history, they were a roadmap to my own terrifying future. The previous owner's fragmented thoughts had painted a picture of a mind unraveling, but now, holding that book, I felt the threads of my own sanity beginning to fray. It wasn't just a story I was reading, it was a contagion. The air grew heavy, not with dust, but with a palpable pressure, like descending into a deep well. My breath hitched. The old study, usually a sanctuary of sorts amidst the manor's decay, now felt like a cage. The shadows deepened, not just from the setting sun, but with an impossible density, swallowing the edges of the room. A whisper, faint as a moth's wing against a windowpane, brushed past my ear. It wasn't a language I recognized, more a sibilant hiss, a suggestion of words without form. My head snapped around, searching the empty corners. Nothing. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. It's just the house settling, I told myself, a lie I no longer believed. Then the floorboards groaned under my weight, a long, drawn-out complaint that seemed to echo from beneath the very foundations. Not an earthquake, but something else, something internal. The room seemed to stretch, the walls subtly bowing, the ceiling pressing down. My vision blurred at the edges, the intricate patterns of the wallpaper twisting into grotesque faces that leered from the periphery. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against them, trying to banish the distortions. When I opened them again, the study was gone. I was standing in a stark, unfamiliar space. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on institutional gray walls. My hands, still raised, were now resting against a thick pane of glass. It wasn't the grimy window of the study. This was different. This was a visiting room with reinforced glass. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the transition. How? When? One moment, the crumbling opulence of the manor, the next, this desolate, functional box. My breath fogged on the cool surface of the glass. I pressed my face closer, peering into the identical, empty room on the other side. Just another gray box, mirroring my own. I looked down at my hands, resting on the glass. They looked like my hands, the calluses from years of restoration work, the faint scar on my left thumb from a slip of a chisel. But they felt detached, like I was observing them from a distance. Then, a sound. A low, guttural murmur that seemed to emanate from the very air around me, not from the room beyond the glass. It pulsed, resonating in my bones, vibrating in my teeth. It wasn't words, not precisely, but a deep, knowing presence, an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly malevolent. It tasted of old grief and forgotten names. My reflection in the reinforced glass shimmered. For a fleeting instant, it wasn't me looking back. The mouth, though still closed, seemed to curl into a faint, knowing smirk that was entirely unread. The question felt foolish, as if I was addressing a phantom, yet the presence intensified, pressing in, smothering. The reflection in the glass shifted. My own features rippled, stretching and contracting as if made of malleable clay. The eyes widened, then narrowed, changing color, then settling on an unnatural, milky white. A thin, bony hand, not mine, rose in the reflection, tracing the outline of my face. A horrifying intimacy. And then, the voice. You forget. You forget your name. You forget your purpose. You forget everything. The words were a hammer blow. My mind scrambled, desperate to cling to something solid. Reid. My name is Reid. I restore antiques. I'm in the Manor. But even as I thought it, the conviction wavered. A new image overlaid my reflection in the glass. It was a face, gaunt and terrified, yet hauntingly familiar. It was the face of the previous owner, the one who had filled the ledger with fragmented warnings. But then, the image fractured, his features merging with mine, blurring the lines until I couldn't tell where he ended and I began. We are all the same. Eventually. The chorus of voices pulsed, growing louder, more insistent. Just another vessel. My head pounded, a frantic drumbeat against the inside of my skull. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I closed my eyes, willing myself back to the study, to the comforting smell of old paper and wood polish. When I opened them again, the stark gray walls of the visiting room persisted. The humming of the fluorescent lights was a drill in my brain. My reflection was back to normal, or what I thought was normal. But the eyes looking back at me seemed distant, vacant, as if something vital had been scooped out. The entity hadn't just attacked my mind, it had started to rewrite me. And I was powerless to stop it. My hands, still cold from the glass, trembled as I stumbled backward. The image, that gaunt, hollow-eyed face, burned behind my eyelids. No. Absolutely not. My mind was playing tricks on me. Stress, isolation, the sheer weight of this decaying place, it was getting to me. I took a ragged breath, pressing the heels of my palms against my eyes, willing the phantom reflection away. When I lowered them, the study was just the study again, familiar, dusty, smelling faintly of lemon polish and forgotten paper. The window showed only the gray, rain-streaked sky. This wasn't just a trick of the light anymore. This was a warning or a threat. I needed to get out. My gaze snapped to the heavy, old-fashioned telephone on the desk, a relic with a rotary dial that surprisingly still worked, at least for local calls. I'd used it a few times to order supplies from the nearest market town. My fingers, still shaking, fumbled with the receiver. I brought it to my ear. Nothing. Not even the faint hum of a dial tone. I pressed the cradle down, released it, tried again. Still nothing. The line was dead. Completely. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. Had the storm knocked it out? Or was this something else? Left back in the kitchen, I remembered. Or was it the bedroom? I couldn't quite recall. My mind felt fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream just after waking. Annoyed, I strode out of the study, determined. My plan was simple: find my phone, try to call the local constable, or the colleague I'd left in charge of my city workshop. Someone. Anyone. If that failed, I'd simply walk out. The manor was isolated, yes, but not entirely cut off. The main road was only a few miles down the winding track. I headed for the kitchen first, my footsteps echoing on the polished flagstones. The kitchen, usually so bright even on a gloomy day, felt oddly dim. I scanned the counters, the old pine table, the windowsill. No phone. A faint, cloying scent, like damp earth and something vaguely metallic, seemed to cling to the air here. It made my stomach clench. Okay, maybe the bedroom then. Each creak of the old wood seemed amplified, a sigh from the house itself. Which one was mine? I hesitated, a sudden, baffling uncertainty seizing me. I walked down one corridor, then another, peeking into forgotten guest rooms filled with shrouded furniture. Each one looked vaguely familiar, yet utterly alien. How could I not remember my own bedroom? Then I saw it. A door at the very end of a narrow, previously unnoticed passage. It was plain, unadorned, utterly out of place amidst the ornate grandeur of the manor. A modern, utilitarian door, painted a drab institutional gray. Curiosity, stronger than my growing fear, tugged me towards it. My fingers brushed the cool metal of the handle. It turned with a soft click. The walls were bare, painted the same dull gray as the door. And dominating the far wall was a massive sheet of reinforced glass, set into a thick, steel frame. This was a visiting room with reinforced glass, unmistakably, but why? In this house? My mind reeled. The absurdity of it was almost comical, if it weren't so profoundly unsettling. I stepped further in, my breath misting in the frigid air. The glass was thick, unblemished, reflecting my own bewildered face back at me. But something was off. The reflection seemed. It wasn't a sound I could understand, but it settled directly into the marrow of my bones. A profound, aching loneliness washed over me, a sense of being utterly, irrevocably cut off. It wasn't just the dead phone, or the lost mobile, or the shifting corridors. It was a barrier deeper than any physical lock or lack of signal. It was a barrier of understanding, of memory, of self. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, I couldn't recall my own name. Who was I? What was I doing here? The manor seemed to sigh, a long, drawn-out sound that vibrated through the floorboards. I was Reid. I was an antique restorer. I was trapped in this accursed house. The entity wasn't just eroding the manor's past, it was carving away at mine, piece by agonizing piece. The house had swallowed me whole, and it was only just beginning to digest. Dot pressed my palms against my temples, trying to physically push the image away. Nothing more. But the chill in my bones lingered, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature of the glass. I needed answers, real answers, not just the dust-choked whispers of the manor. My research had hit a wall of redacted documents and burnt-out archives. The local historians, when they bothered to respond, offered only vague warnings about unsettled spirits and old ground. But one name kept surfacing, a man who had once worked for the estate, alone. Time ago, before the manor was completely abandoned. A man now kept in a secure facility, miles from anywhere, for reasons no one would articulate. It was a long shot, a desperate one, but the gaunt face in the reflection had solidified my resolve. I had to know. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and something else, something stale and faintly metallic, like old blood. After a frustrating hour of paperwork and hushed conversations with a stern administrator, I was led down a sterile corridor. "He doesn't speak much," the administrator murmured, her voice flat, "and when he does, it rarely makes sense. He calls it the gnawing. Be quick." She stopped before a heavy door, which she unlocked with a series of precise clicks. Inside, another door, equally heavy, led into a small, stark chamber. This was the visiting room with reinforced glass. A thick, unblemished pane separated two identical, sparsely furnished sides. On my side, a single plastic chair. On the other, another chair, currently occupied by an old man. He was thin, almost skeletal, his skin like stretched parchment over sharp bones. His eyes, though, were what caught me. They were wide, unfocused, darting around the room as if tracking invisible flies. He wore a simple gray smock, and his hands, gnarled and trembling, picked incessantly at the fabric over his knees. There was a faint hum, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room, distinct from the building's ventilation. "Hello?" I said, leaning closer to the glass, my voice sounding strangely loud in the quiet space. "My name is Reid. I own the old Blackwood Manor." His head snapped up, those terrible eyes fixing on me. He didn't speak, but his lips moved, forming silent, frantic words. Then, a low, guttural sound escaped him, a sound like a dry cough mixed with a whimper. "The manor," I pressed, trying to keep my voice calm, steady. "Do you know anything about its history?" "About what lives there?" He flinched violently at the last word, recoiling as if struck. His gaze shifted from me to the glass, then to his own hands, then back to me, frantic. "Oh, it remembers." "What remembers?" I urged, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "The house? Or something else?" He laughed then, a dry, brittle sound that sent shivers down my spine. "The house is just a shell. A cage. It's the thing inside. The hungry thing. It wakes when the memories gather." Was he talking about my memories? Yes. Yours. Mine. Everyone who ever lived there, loved there, died there. It drinks them. Slowly. Like a slow poison. First the little things. A name. A face. A childhood street. Then the big things. Who you are. What you want. Why you're here. His voice grew stronger, more frantic, a desperate urgency creeping in. It was here before the house. Before the land was named. It was the whisper in the dark, the chill in the hollows. It's an echo. It wears them like a coat. It becomes the sorrow, the joy, the fear. It lives through you, as you, until there's nothing left but an empty vessel. And then it moves on, leaving only a ghost of a ghost. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his eyes now blazing with a terrible clarity that belied his earlier madness. "You're restoring it, aren't you? Bringing back the past? You're feeding it. Every memory you uncover, every forgotten detail, every ghost you summon. It's a feast for the thing that watches." The truth, when it came, hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a malevolent spirit, a lingering presence. It was something far more insidious, a parasitic entity that didn't just haunt, but consumed. It wasn't about appeasing it with offerings or banishing it with rituals. It fed. It consumed the very essence of personhood, leaving behind husks. And I, in my meticulous quest to restore the manor, had been unwittingly fattening it. What does it want? I asked, my voice barely a croak. What does it need to be appeased? Or defeated? He leaned forward, pressing his own face against the glass, his breath fogging the clear surface. His eyes were wide, pleading. It wants everything. It wants you. The only way to stop the gnawing is to give it something it can't digest. Something so strong, so pure, so utterly unforgettable that it chokes. A sacrifice. Not of blood, not of wealth. Of self. A memory so profound, an identity so singular, that it either consumes itself trying to hold it, or it recoils, leaving you empty. A blank slate. Who would choose to be nobody? The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The ultimate cost. To defeat it, I would have to offer up my very identity, my history, my sense of self. To become a blank slate, an empty vessel, but one that the entity could not fill. Or, I could continue to fight, to restore, to unknowingly feed the beast until there was nothing left of me anyway. The choice, stark and horrifying, was laid bare. The low hum in the room seemed to deepen, vibrating not just in the air, but in my very bones, a growing hunger. The reinforced glass between us felt colder than any winter morning I could recall. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the phantom chill seep into my bones, a physical echo of the emptiness that had begun to bloom inside me. My voice sounded thin, like brittle parchment. It was getting harder. My memories, once a meticulously catalogued library, were now a shifting dune of sand, each grain indistinguishable from the next. The colleague leaned forward, his mouth moving, but the sound was muffled, distorted by the thick barrier. Now it was a scream in my skull, a constant, low thrum that vibrated through my very core. My plan. It was a fragile thing, pieced together from fragments of clarity, like shards of stained glass reflecting a distorted image. But it was my plan, perhaps the last truly original thought I had left. It feeds, I said, louder this time, enunciating each syllable with deliberate force. On identity. On memory. On. He still thought it was a delusion, a breakdown. He couldn't see the truth. I longed for that smell, for the musty embrace of history, even as it poisoned me. So, I continued, pushing the words past the growing fog in my mind. If there's nothing to take. If there's no self to consume. I trailed off, searching for the precise terminology. Then it starves. The colleague's eyes widened fractionally. He was beginning to grasp the implication, even if he didn't believe the premise. I have to become. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was literal. Not physically, but from the inside out. The ultimate cost, indeed. My memories of my family. My childhood. My very name. I looked at him, desperately trying to convey the enormity of it. All of it. Gone. Purged. I have to let it go. A tremor ran through me, a premonition of the vast, terrifying emptiness I was about to invite. It was a kind of psychological suicide, a deliberate unmaking of Reid. The entity had been doing it slowly, incrementally, but I would finish the job. I would accelerate its process, but twist it, weaponize it. The colleague slowly shook his head, a gesture of profound sadness. He mouthed something that looked like Reid, no. But the sound was lost. He saw only a man unraveling, not a man making a desperate, calculated gamble. "The manor," I explained, finding a sudden surge of focus. "It's the conduit. The place where it latches. I have to go back. I have to sever the connection." My plan was to systematically destroy every vestige of my presence, my identity, my life within those walls. Not just the physical objects, but the emotional resonance, the memories tied to them. I would burn the library of my mind, page by agonizing page. The hardest part, I knew, wouldn't be the physical act, but the mental one. To remember, then deliberately forget. To feel, then deliberately unfeel. It was a monstrous undertaking, a violation of every instinct for self-preservation. The fear was still there, a gnawing beast, but beneath it, a strange sense of peace. This was it. My final restoration. Not of an antique, but of a broken world, by sacrificing the last thing I had left to give. Myself. I had explained it. Or, at least, I had tried. The colleague watched me, his face etched with sorrow. He didn't understand, but he saw the determination. And that was enough. Before I was finished, the air in the visiting room with reinforced glass was colder than anywhere else in the manor, a sterile chill that bit at my exposed skin. I'd spent days sealing it, reinforcing it, making it an island of stark, defiant modernity within the crumbling antiquity of the house. The reinforced glass, thick as my forearm, separated me from everything. From the manor, from the entity, from the encroaching madness that had become my constant companion. It was my arena, my cage, my last stand. I sat on the single metal stool I dragged in, hands resting on my knees. No distractions, no objects to anchor me. Just me. Just Reid. Or what was left of him. The tremor from the previous night had settled into a low thrum beneath my ribs, a nervous anticipation. This wasn't just a battle for my life, it was a battle for the very concept of me. The plan was audacious, suicidal even. I would open the gate, invite the wolf into the fold, but on my terms. I would accelerate the entity's consumption, offering it a feast, but one laced with poison. I needed to give it access, to allow it to delve deep, to tear and rend, but I had to hold on to a single, inviolable core. A seed of self that it could not touch. A shiver, not of cold, but of something ancient and vast, snaked through the room. The reinforced glass, usually opaque with condensation and grime, began to shimmer, not reflecting, but absorbing the dim light. It was like looking into a deep well, the surface of which was just beginning to ripple. Then it started. A memory. My mother's laugh, bright and clear, echoing through a sun-drenched kitchen. The smell of her baking bread, yeasty and warm. I saw her face, younger, unlined, beaming at me. But then, the edges blurred. Her eyes, so kind, became flat, devoid of light. Her laugh warped, stretching into a guttural, mocking sound. The scent of bread turned to something acrid, like burnt sugar. My mind recoiled, but I forced myself to hold steady. This was the lure. Images flashed behind my closed eyelids, a dizzying kaleidoscope of my life. My first day at the academy, the smell of turpentine and aged wood. My mentor's gruff but encouraging words. The satisfaction of restoring a particularly challenging antique, the grain of the wood coming alive under my touch. Each memory was presented, then subtly, insidiously corrupted. The turpentine became the stench of decay. My mentor's face contorted into a sneer, his words dripping with contempt. The antique crumbled to dust in my hands, its beauty turning to rot. A wave of nausea washed over me. It was trying to destabilize me, to make me doubt the very foundations of my existence. If my past was a lie, if my achievements were illusions, then who was Reid? "I know what you are," I gritted out, forcing my eyes open. The reinforced glass was now a swirling vortex of indistinct shapes and colors, like a storm trapped behind the barrier. "You feed on the truth, then replace it with emptiness." The entity shifted tactics. It stopped twisting memories and started erasing them. A specific detail about my first restoration project vanished. Then the name of the piece itself. Then the entire project. It was gone, a blank space where a vibrant memory had been. Panic clawed at my throat. This was the unmaking. This was the psychological suicide I had invited. But I had a counter. "You want my memories?" I challenged, my voice shaking but firm. "Take them. Take them all." I focused, not on resisting the erosion, but on offering it. I pushed forward a carefully constructed facade, a labyrinth of fabricated experiences and half-truths I'd been building for weeks. Memories of a childhood I never had, a career path I'd never pursued, relationships that never existed. I fed it a false history, a decoy identity, a meticulously crafted shell of a person. The entity greedily devoured it. I felt its presence surge, a ravenous hunger consuming the false data. For a moment, there was a terrible, exhilarating rush of emptiness, as if a part of my mind had been scooped out. But it wasn't my part. It was the bait. As it consumed the fabricated past, I felt a strange shift. A moment of clarity in the chaos. The entity wasn't just taking, it was integrating. It was trying to become this false Reid, to inhabit the identity I had presented. This was the reveal, the core of my plan. The entity didn't just erase, it became. It consumed and then mimicked the identity, attempting to wear it like a skin. But if it consumed a false identity, one designed with a fatal flaw. I pushed harder, pouring more of the fabricated memories into the maelstrom. The reinforced glass pulsed with an internal light, reflecting nothing, only containing the growing storm. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes. I felt stretched thin, like a canvas about to tear. The entity was deep within the decoy now, thrashing, consuming, trying to make sense of the contradictory information I'd woven into the false identity. It was too much, too fast, too inconsistent. It was a poison, designed to overload its capacity to assimilate, to choke it on its own gluttony. I held onto one memory, a single, simple image, the smooth, cool feel of a perfectly restored mahogany surface beneath my fingertips. No grand triumph, no emotional peak, just the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of my craft. It was small, insignificant, but it was mine. It was Reid. And I would not let it go. The reinforced glass began to crack. Not outwardly, but from within, like lightning bolts trapped in a solid block. The internal storm intensified, a silent scream of conflicting identities and shattered narratives. I watched, breathless, as the entity thrashed, struggling against the very identity it had tried to consume. It was a visceral, psychological battle, and I was losing everything to win. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound, it was a physical weight, pressing against my eardrums, threatening to collapse the very space around me. The internal light that had pulsed within the reinforced glass, reflecting nothing but its own furious energy, sputtered and died. One moment, a roaring, blinding vortex, the next, a flat, inert pain, thick and unyielding, mirroring only the dull, institutional glow of the visiting room. My hands, still pressed against the cool surface, felt alien, the skin clammy and slick. I pulled them back slowly, watching the faint condensation of my breath dissipate. I swayed, my knees threatening to buckle, and stumbled back against the hard plastic chair. The plastic creaked to protest. The room, stark and utilitarian, seemed to tilt. Gray walls, a scuffed linoleum floor, the heavy, bolted-down table between me and the glass. Everything was too sharp, too defined, yet simultaneously blurred, as if my vision was fighting to hold on to details it no longer understood. What had just happened? A maelstrom. Memories. My memories? No, not mine. Fabricated. Pushed. Into. What? My gaze fixed on the reinforced glass. It was just a wall now, a barrier. Was it empty? Or was it just quiet? Nothing. Just the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the building's ventilation system. It felt like my very essence had been wrung out, bleached clean. It was my name, I knew that. A deep, instinctive knowing. But the memories attached to it, the rich tapestry of experiences, the sharp edges of identity, they were gone, or at least muted, softened to an unrecognizable haze. A faint click of a lock echoed from the door behind me, followed by the soft scuff of shoes. I flinched, my eyes snapping open. A tall, broad-shouldered attendant, dressed in a gray uniform, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He carried a clipboard, his expression unreadable. Reid, his voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Annoyance? Crossing his features before settling back into neutrality. To your room. My room. The phrase held no meaning. Where was my room? Was this not my room? The visiting room with reinforced glass. The words were a label, nothing more. I looked around the sterile space, then back at the attendant. He was waiting, patiently, but with an underlying current of expectation that made my skin prickle. I knew how to speak, how to form sentences, but the context, the personal history that gave meaning to those words, was largely absent. He sighed, a soft expulsion of air. You've been through a lot, Reid. It's understandable. He gestured vaguely towards the door. We'll get you settled. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching, protesting. There was nothing there. It was simply a wall. A barrier. A containment. But what had been contained? And at what cost? As I followed the attendant down a long, dimly lit corridor, the concrete floor echoing with our footsteps, I tried desperately to grasp onto something, anything, from before. My name was Reid. I knew that. But what did I do? What was my profession? A word, restorer, flickered at the edge of my awareness, then vanished, leaving behind only a vague sense of a craftsman's hands, the smell of old wood, the delicate touch of a brush. It was a ghost of a memory, a scent rather than a substance. The Manor. The decaying, isolated Manor. The reason I was here. The source of it all. It was a beautiful, terrifying image, but it felt like a scene from a book I'd once read, not a place I had lived, breathed, fought within. Who had I been in that manor? What had I sought? The malevolent, ancient entity that fed on memory and identity. The attendant stopped at a heavy metal door, its surface smooth and unyielding. He turned a key, the click loud in the quiet corridor. Here we are, Reid. I looked at him, then at the door, then back at him. My face felt blank, my eyes wide. The entity might be contained behind that reinforced glass, sealed away from the world, but it had left its mark. A gaping, unfillable wound in the very fabric of my being. I had one. But what exactly had I saved? And who, in the process, had I become? The questions echoed in the vast, empty chambers of my mind, and I had no answers. The scars were not visible, not on my skin, but they ran deeper, carving absence into the very core of my identity. A gaping hole. That's what it was. A void where something fundamental used to be, a missing piece of the puzzle that was Reid. I felt the detective's gaze on me across the table in the visiting room with reinforced glass, but his words, his questions, they just skittered off the surface of my mind like pebbles on ice. The reinforced glass between us, meant to keep it in, felt more like it was keeping me out. Out of my own head, perhaps. They let me go, eventually. There was no evidence, they said, beyond my own increasingly fragmented testimony. The manor was condemned, a derelict shell, its dark heart finally exposed and, they hoped, neutralized. I signed papers, nodded at instructions I barely processed, and stepped back into a world that felt different. Sharper, yet somehow duller. Like a photograph that had been oversaturated in some places, desaturated in others. My first thought was to escape. To put as much distance between myself and that desolate estate as possible. I bought a small, unassuming cottage in a coastal town, miles from any city, miles from any grand, decaying architecture. But the precision, the absolute focus I once possessed, was gone. My fingers, once so deft, now trembled slightly when I reached for a delicate tool. I'd look at a Chippendale chair, its intricate carvings a testament to centuries of craftsmanship, and find myself staring blankly, unable to recall the exact historical period, the specific artisan's mark. Little things, at first. Easily dismissed as fatigue, as trauma. Then came the memories. Not my memories, not precisely. I'd be polishing a small, ornate music box, and suddenly, I'd have a flash of a child's laughter echoing in a sun-drenched nursery I'd never seen. It wasn't a vision, not exactly. I went for long walks along the shore, the wind whipping my hair, the roar of the waves a constant, deafening presence. I tried to anchor myself to the present, to the tangible reality of sand between my toes, the bite of salt on my tongue. A memory of a ship, not mine, sinking beneath a furious sky. My determination to rebuild my life became a desperate, losing battle. I'd wake in the night, not from nightmares, but from a profound sense of wrongness. A tightness around the eyes that wasn't quite mine, a flicker of something ancient and knowing. One afternoon, I was working on a particularly challenging piece, a grandfather clock, its mechanism seized, its face cracked. I'd always loved clocks, their intricate dance of gears and springs, their steadfast march through time. As I painstakingly cleaned a tiny brass cog, a strange warmth spread through my fingertips. It wasn't the warmth of friction, but something deeper, almost organic. And then I knew. I didn't just understand the clock's mechanism, I understood its life. I felt the weight of every second it had ticked, every hour it had chimed. The mornings it had witnessed, the deaths it had marked. I felt the quiet hum of the house it had stood in, the footsteps that had passed it by, the arguments, the embraces. I felt the slow erosion of paint from the wall behind it, the dust motes dancing in sunbeams, the gradual decay of existence. It wasn't a memory I was recalling, it was a memory I was absorbing. Not just from the clock, but through the clock. It wasn't contained in the manor, not truly. It was in me. My mind, once a meticulous archive of history and craft, was now a porous vessel, constantly siphoning the echoes of the past from every object I touched, every surface I perceived. I dropped the tiny cog. It clattered to the floor, a mundane sound that suddenly felt impossibly loud. I looked down at my hands, my own hands, and saw them not as instruments of restoration, but as conduits. My victory had been nothing more than a transmutation. I wasn't just Reid anymore. I was a living relic, a walking archive of stolen lives, a silent hum of forgotten histories. The entity hadn't been defeated, it had simply found a new, more intimate home. It was growing. And I was beginning to crave it.